Hello again, I'm Zincle Samoa, or at Simply Zincle, welcoming you to day 2 of the 2021 Aspen Ideas Festival. For 17 years, this festival has been the meeting place for big thinking about the state of humanity and the world. We've welcomed people who see big opportunities, who can tell us about the big advancements in science and technology, who can shine a light on the big problems that society is facing, and who have the audacity to think they can do something about it. This year, we're broadcasting those big ideas out into the wide world. We hope you'll join us for our evening sessions, as well as the many breakout sessions that happen each morning. You can find out more about those at aspenideas.info/2021. This evening, we'll talk about the forces that encourage populations to move within countries and how it's already happening right here. We'll discuss how the private sector can help move historically excluded communities into a more inclusive economy. We'll talk about how museums can move us to think more clearly about the past and about the future we're building. Thank you for joining us today and for the next 3 days at the 2021 Aspen Ideas Festival. People often think that museums are for memorializing the past, but their mission is more about contextualizing the present and helping us imagine the future. Lonnie Bunch, Secretary of the Smithsonian, talks with Jonathan Capehart about how museums can help us curate clarity from chaos.
Secretary Lonnie Bunch, thank you very much for coming to the Aspen Ideas Festival.
Very excited to be here, especially with you.
You're always so kind. So as Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, you're the 14th Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, also the first historian and the first African American to hold that job. But the Smithsonian is 19 museums, 21 libraries, this I didn't know, the National Zoo, and a number of smaller research and educational centers under your leadership. What binds the very diverse collection of institutions together that you now lead?
In many ways, the Smithsonian is part of the glue that holds a country together. And what keeps the Smithsonian together is the creativity, the scholarship, the research, the exhibitions, the collections. And what they do really is, through the work we do, the Smithsonian tries to define reality and give hope.
So, Lonnie, over the last year and a half, we've all been going through trials and tribulations. But I can imagine that at the Smithsonian, with all those institutions under your umbrella, that those trials and tribulations have been very challenging for the institution. Talk about those challenges, and within those challenges, have any opportunities presented themselves?
It was very important for us to wrestle with two things. First, to make sure that we would protect the safety of our visitors, our collection, and our staff. But then it was to recognize that this was a moment not to just survive, but to really reimagine the Smithsonian, to use this time to say, how does the Smithsonian become a more nimble 21st century organization that serves the public more effectively? In many ways, it forced us to really push into the notion of what's the virtual Smithsonian. We have millions and millions of people who come to the Smithsonian every year, but suddenly we realized that we now, instead of being digital first, we had to become digital only. So it really allowed us to think about how do we ensure that the wonders of the Smithsonian, the educational material of the Smithsonian, is available for all. And then it really forced us to think about, well, what does it really mean to be a post-pandemic Smithsonian? What does it mean in terms of the way staff works? What does it mean in terms of maybe new business models? Do we create new ways to make sure that we survive a kind of moment when the Smithsonian has to close? So in essence, it really was, how does the Smithsonian make sure that it does what it's been doing for 175 years? Serve the American public, challenge the American public, and make the American public better.
That last answer actually dovetails nicely with what I was next going to ask you. You used the phrase post-pandemic Smithsonian, and for a while now, we've been talking about whether we are in a post-truth society. As an institution, how does the Smithsonian fill this space or play in this space when we've got people questioning everything from elections to vaccines?
In some ways, the Smithsonian is this trusted brand. And one of the things that I love about the Smithsonian is we're able to bring together people who don't agree on many things, but they'll trust the Smithsonian. So in essence, the Smithsonian first and foremost is a place driven by scholarship. We believe that there are truths. We believe that our job is to help people understand that there are different points of view, but be that as it may, that there is really an opportunity to sort of educate and be trusted. And so ultimately, the Smithsonian's job in some ways is to make sure that we help people embrace ambiguity. So often, we as Americans like simple answers to complex questions. Well, the Smithsonian is nothing if it's not complex through the stories we tell. So part of our goal is to use our scholarship, use our expertise to help the public embrace ambiguity and deal with complexity and nuance and subtlety.
Embrace ambiguity, complexity, but the word that came to my mind is nuance. Have we lost the ability to understand nuance?
Oh, I think that's a real important issue. I think that we have lost the ability not only to understand nuance, but to recognize that different points of view aren't really critical to sort of challenging a nation to be better. And that in essence, it's okay to have debates as long as they're reasoned and based on scholarship. I think that what I'd love to be able to do is to remind people that civil debates have always moved this country forward. So that we shouldn't be afraid of debates. We shouldn't be afraid of our history. We should recognize that it is that history that propels us towards a better future.
You know, perhaps your best known creation is the National Museum of African American History and Culture, or as I call it, the jewel on the mall. Couple questions here. One, why did it take so long to get the museum approved, dedicated, and built? Why was there resistance?
Well, as you know, it was a 100-year journey to build this museum. Part of the resistance, I would argue, comes from America's unwillingness to deal with all the dark corners of its past. I think that there was a sense that if you build a museum, it's about America being a place that didn't live up to its ideals. And doesn't that go counter to our notion of America's always the sort of place where, you know, the good guys and good women always are? And my argument is that part of the great strength of building a National Museum of African American History and Culture is that it does illuminate all of our dark corners, but it does allow us to realize that if we don't understand that past, not only do we not understand the African American experience, we don't understand the American experience. So I think there was this real hesitancy that this would be a museum that would not celebrate America. And I would argue it celebrates America by challenging America. It celebrates America by helping people understand what happens when people come together and help America live up to its stated ideals.
Do you think, I mean, and especially over the last year and a half, we've not only been dealing with a global pandemic, health pandemic, but we've also been dealing with the pandemic of systemic racism and people having their eyes opened, some for the very first time, to the issue because of the murder of George Floyd. And do you think that the National Museum of African American History and Culture, did it actually arrive right on time in terms of being a place, whether physically or at that point, at the murder of George Floyd, virtually a place where people could go to get answers, to get at the truth?
In many ways, the museum really was opened at a time that America needed it and America deserved it. The opportunity, as a result of the challenges of the murder of George Floyd and systemic racism, the opportunity to, one, first use history, to help people understand, to contextualize this moment, to talk about the long history of racial violence, but also to find hope, to recognize that there have been moments where the country has changed, where people have come together to say, we have to live up to our stated ideals. What it also reminds us, however, is that it's a long, ongoing journey to do that. that any change in America is part of a long struggle, but that you have to then work hard to protect those changes. So that, in essence, the promised land of racial equality is a long way away. But one of the great strengths of America is people coming together to challenge itself to live up to the best of what its ideals are.
You know, in a recent conversation you and I had about the museum, you said something that I should have realized, and that is, you know, we look at museums and we think of them that, oh, here's this building, this structure, and all of these artifacts are in there. And I don't know if a lot of people pay attention to the fact that the architecture of the museum plays a role in telling the story of the museum. And you talked about how in the museum, you of course you walk in in the basement really, and you start with slavery. But the way you go through these exhibits architecturally, you're going seemingly backwards and forwards as you advance through the museum. Talk a little bit about that and how that plays a role in helping people understand the history of our country.
You know, a museum is really like a film in a way, that you use different moments of juxtaposition, of excitement to move people forward. And that what I wanted to do is counter the notion that it's been a linear march to progress, that we started in slavery and, we're at the promised land. What I wanted people to realize is that the struggle to have America live up to its ideals is a struggle that goes back and forth. When you walk from the lower depths of the museum, you walk back and forth into history, so that there's not sort of progress that's not unbroken. That rather what you see is it's an ongoing struggle, and it's a struggle that the progress is fragile. And so I wanted the museum to both have you immersed in the depths of the African American experience, and then begin to see how change has occurred over time, and that ultimately what you see is a culture that has profoundly shaped the country, not just a particular community.
In the little bit of time that we have left, actually less than 5 minutes, you've had a few years to think about what the role of a museum is or should be. Tell me about your vision and how you see the Smithsonian. Now that you are the secretary of the institution, how do you see the Smithsonian embodying this role over the years to come?
The Smithsonian has always been a place that has helped the country think about its future, whether it was early work in aviation or the scientific research of the 19th century in terms of astronomy, or whether it was in post-World War II, helping Americans understand and redefine their sense of what it means to be an American. So in some ways, the Smithsonian has always been a place of value. So the question is, how is the Smithsonian now of value in traditional ways? Great exhibitions, wonderful scholarship, but also in non-traditional ways. How do we help the public grapple with contemporary issues? My goal is that the Smithsonian becomes a place that is ripe with scholarship and education, where people will find inspiration. But it is also a place where people will find context and understanding. That ultimately what I want the Smithsonian to be is a place that has a contemporary resonance, that gives the public tools to help them live their lives, whether it's grappling with climate change or the impact of technology or systemic racism. Ultimately, what you want the Smithsonian to be is a place that uses its resources, its wonder, its scholarship to help make a country better. To recognize that at a time when a nation is in crisis, all its institutions need to do the best they can to provide reality, understanding, and hope.
I'm going to squeeze in one more question, and that is this. Do you have it in you to open up another museum?
The challenge of opening two new museums, a National Museum of American Women's History and a National American Latino Museum, it's a great challenge. But I'll tell you, no place but the Smithsonian can do that. We can bring the expertise. I've learned a lot in the 11 years it took me to open the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And I am convinced the Smithsonian can craft two museums that really do two things. One, that would provide the public a reservoir of information and excitement to dip into about Latino culture or the role of women's history. but also it can shape these museums so they're lenses into understanding what it means to be an American. How these stories shape us all, are owned by us all, and we're made better when we know these stories. So there's a lot of work to be done, but I am so humbled that the Smithsonian has the opportunity to expand our notions as Americans of what it means to be an American.
Lonnie Bunch, 14th Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, thank you very much for coming back to Ideas Festival.
It is my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
After a year of pandemic, we're looking forward to a year of promise. We asked some of our past Aspen Ideas speakers and fellows, what are you hopeful for?
Cleaner energy, more environmental justice, and more awareness of the natural world.
Creative technology, being a tool for making more resilient individuals, groups, and communities. I'm hopeful that the more empathetic, inclusive, and diverse this space is, the more it will truly be of, by, for all, and make a better world.
The energy and heart young people are putting into addressing the profound inequities in our society.
I'm hopeful that people will focus more on local resources and experiences and cultivate their immediate environment with greater care.
Income inequality finally being on the agenda. Although yes, inequality has skyrocketed during the pandemic, at least the idea of addressing inequality in the United States is in the national consciousness in a way that it just wasn't a decade ago. I'm hopeful that we can build on that and really start to help people.
Rethinking education, what schooling can and should be, both for young children and in college. Reflecting on what we are preparing students for. I hope we can see what implicit parts of schooling are valuable, what explicit parts are not, and reconceive the traditional school day in class.
I'm hopeful that equity will not become a buzzword. The pandemic taught us that systemic inequities affect not just one, but all. Philanthropic, corporate, and public funding have begun distributing funds in an equitable manner. But we cannot fund merely in crisis. We must invest for resilience.
The possibility that the culture of protest will survive.
The joy that comes with simple pleasures, like bumping into someone unexpectedly at a subway stop or getting to a new city and having conversations with random people at a bar. Also, hugs.
As we work to welcome a greater number of visitors to our campus in Aspen, Colorado, we'd like to share small snapshots that not only show you this place, but also how it is relevant to the spirit of the Aspen Institute. Here in Anderson Park, designed by Herbert Bayer as the connecting green space between the east and west ends of campus, between the residential side and the Institute's workspaces, one can find the Harry Blackmun Rock, a marker in one of the late Supreme Court Justice's most treasured places. Starting in the summer of 1979, Justice Blackmun first came to moderate a seminar. Blackmun reflected on his time in Aspen. Each of us was exposed to new approaches and new thoughts, and each was provoked to examining critically what usually is taken for granted, and with a long view of the law, not just the exigency of the particular case. Part of Blackmun's ashes were also scattered here. We've welcomed many U.S. Supreme Court justices to the Aspen Ideas Festival stages who have shared their insights and experiences on their lives and the law. Aspen Ideas Festival is generously underwritten by Allstate, IBM, MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, Mount Sinai, PayPal, Walton Family Foundation, Verizon, and YouTube. Also, thanks to Prudential and the Rise Fund. And now we'll examine the depths of the racial wealth gap, looking at facets of systemic racism that perpetuate it. In a conversation with Bloomberg Chartia Brantley, PayPal CEO Dan Schulman will address the role the private sector must play as the nation works to build a just and inclusive economy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shertia Brantley, and I'm delighted to be joined here at the virtual Aspen Ideas Festival with PayPal CEO Dan Schulman. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks, Shertia. So good to see you. Wish we were together.
Likewise, hopefully in the near future. You know, we recently commemorated the 1-year anniversary of the killing of George Floyd. You know, his death, along with those of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, sparked global protests for racial justice and equality. How have you been impacted as a leader and personally?
Yeah. Well, post the death of George Floyd, and as you mentioned, so many others, I never really experienced or saw the amount of emotional outpouring across our country, but really amongst every employee inside PayPal. And there was such, frustration and despair and anger, obviously some hope that maybe this might be different this time. But it was clear to me that we needed to stand up and make a statement, make a real statement. And there's a lot that I needed to learn personally. I spoke to a lot of Black leaders across PayPal, a lot of Black leaders across the country. And one of the things that they taught me was that we needed to make this a movement and not a moment in time. Because we were thinking initially that we were going to donate a couple of $1 million to some very well-deserving nonprofits. And a lot of the leaders that I spoke to in the country said, Dan, that's a really great thing, but that's not going to change the needle going forward. We need corporations to really stand up for their values, make sure that they're heard and really make an impact. And that's why, after a lot of conversations and a lot of thought, we decided to make a $535 million commitment to fight racial inequality, to stand up for social justice movements. And that to me was such a watershed moment inside PayPal and for me personally.
So that is a huge pledge and commitment. What are some of the short, medium, and long-term investments you're making with this money?
Yeah, well, we wanted to make sure that we could help in the short term. For instance, Black-owned businesses that, as you know, Shartia, were going out of business at a rate of 41%. That's almost double the national average. So there was a desperate need for an infusion of capital into Black small-owned businesses. And then there are nonprofits that needed money desperately because there was so much demand for their services. And so we wanted to put money into those organizations as well. But if you were really going to go about addressing the racial wealth gap, which has been with us at exactly the same level since the last civil rights movement in the late 1960s, it hasn't improved at all. And we felt like that was something that we might be able to address. For instance, we gave $15 million of grants, not loans, but outright grants, to about 1,400 Black-owned businesses. They were so desperate for that money because for so many reasons, they just couldn't access the financial system, banks and that kind of thing. Here is the thing that I'm most encouraged about. 90% of those businesses that we gave grants to are still in business today. And as I mentioned, 41% of Black-owned small businesses were going out of business. And so they just needed access to capital to really survive. And so the impact that we saw both in the short term and now what we're seeing as we do, investments that will help, create opportunities for real, I think, wealth creation are just beginning right now. And that's why I say, like, we're in this fight over the long run. It's not just a short-term battle. We can't just say, okay, we did this and now let's focus on something else. The only way to really address this systemic issue is to be there year after year after year, and not just give money, but give services, advice, counsel, team up with different nonprofit organizations, with academia, with government, to really try and figure out how do we address this issue that is going to be with us for a long time. And we shouldn't think there are any easy answers, but that does not abdicate us from our responsibility of standing up and being part of the fight.
I think one thing that I was amazed about last year, just hearing the number of major CEOs use the words systemic racism. And, you've talked about being, you have to be anti-racist. Can you expand on that as we all try to, dismantle systemic racism?
Yeah, I think anti-racist to me means leaning in and really being part of the fight. It's not addressing something or taking a short-term stand, but taking a long-term stand. We have issues that have vexed us as a country for a long, long time. I think that leaders of corporations now have maybe a moral obligation to stand up, to address these kind of issues. We can't just rely on the public sector to take the lead. I mean, we have so much resource inside our companies. We have control of the financial health of our own employees. I mean, measuring that, helping assure that all of our own are taken care of. Because, I mean, if you've got these issues that are systemic across the country, really across the world, then no doubt inside your company, you have the same issues. And, there's no excuse for us not to address those inside the company. And I think a lot of people are worried when they come into this that they'll say the wrong words or, they'll be misunderstood. And what I said to all of our employees is we need to go into these conversations that are difficult conversations, that are emotionally charged conversations, with an open heart, and with a knowing that we're trying to address the issues, but we may not always get it right. But the enormity of the issue should not overwhelm any of us from taking action.
Well, do you think this time is different? Are you seeing a sea change within the corporate community at this time?
It's a great question. And I ask myself that same question many times. I am seeing a very legitimate addressing of some of these issues by some companies, but not by all yet. And I think we each need to encourage each other, because how we go about it at PayPal and how another company goes about it, it can be very different. And, they have to be aligned with the values of those companies. But one of the things that a couple of us are doing, Robert Smith and Rich Lesson at BCG, we formed a group that is looking at a number of Southern communities right now where we can take all of the different commitments that have been made by corporations and really leverage them together and really see, in a certain community in a city like Memphis or something like that, can we make a real difference by leveraging the learning? If somebody is going to be addressing something into housing issues or education issues, we're looking at, the racial wealth gap. If we all work together in a community, are there lessons we can learn by the power of that collective? And then can we expand that to other cities and other communities and really have a blueprint to move forward? And I think if we can start to show that our efforts are really making a difference, we are all connected together. Every business, our communities, our economy, our democracy, they all rely on us addressing these issues together. And I don't think any company can think that it's an island unto itself, because we aren't. We are a part of our neighborhoods, and we are a part of our economies, and we are part of our democracy. And we all need to stand up. If we ever want to move from being good companies to great companies, we need to move from being a society that has all these systemic inequality built into it to being one that is much more just going forward. And I think if we can do that, we can have a thriving democracy. We can have people that think the system is working for them, be involved, rise above their own self-interest, and make our country as great as it can be.
Well said. We must leave it there, Dan. Thank you so much. Good talk to you all day.
Yeah, sure, Tim. Me too. I could speak to you all day long as well.
Thank you.
Last year, we lost civil rights legend John Lewis. He came to the Aspen Ideas Festival in 2014 on the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act.
Your generation, young people, have an obligation, a mission, and a mandate to push and pull and not be satisfied.
My big idea is to leave this world, to leave this little piece of real estate, to leave this little planet a little greener, a little cleaner, and a little more peaceful for generation yet unborn. That is my big idea.
Global strategy advisor, best-selling author, and world traveler. He studied the long history of migration and will tell us about the forces already causing America's next shifts in population and in our thinking.
Hi, I'm Parag Khanna, and in this Aspen lecture, I'm going to explore how deep forces such as demographics and climate change are reshaping the American dream. America has long had the good fortune to take its bounteous geography for granted. In the early 1700s, we still didn't quite grasp how vast North America actually is. In the 19th century, after the Louisiana Purchase, America began to truly harness this continental potential. A new vision took root in American civilization: manifest destiny. The spirit of manifest destiny motivated American settlers to move beyond the Mississippi to tame the vast western frontier all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Many saw manifest destiny as a divine mission, as embodied in this 1872 painting by John Gast. President James Polk was the most vigorous advocate of expansionism, which brought with it the subjugation of Native Americans and tensions over slavery that sparked the Civil War. But by the 1890s, manifest destiny was complete, from sea to shining sea, between the Atlantic and the Pacific, Canada and Mexico. It was also an international enterprise. There was the purchase of Alaska in 1867 and the annexation of Hawaii in 1898 during the Spanish-American War. America today doesn't need to conquer more land. 330 million people seem to fit pretty well inside it. But that doesn't mean that Americans will stop moving. In fact, we might be on the cusp of the next manifest destiny. So what are the forces that will uproot Americans in the 21st century? The first is a plateau in the nation's population. Now, the relationship between demographics, economics, and geography is a complex one. But America is aging rapidly. As baby boomers age or pass away, not enough children are being born or immigrants admitted to replace them. There are now more Americans older than 80 as there are babies under the age of 2. As a result, there are ever fewer young people available to support both physically and fiscally, the growing number of American retirees. Countries with high dependency ratios, such as Japan or those in Western Europe, tend to have slow growth, high taxes, and less dynamism than what America has demonstrated in generations past. And between the Trump administration's restrictive immigration policies and the pandemic, America's share of the annual flows of migrants has continued to decline steadily. And even with the immigration reforms underway, migration may remain far below the historical norm for years to come due to the pandemic and political polarization. And now comes the pandemic baby bust. And it's the second one in just over a decade. After the financial crisis of 2008, economic insecurity caused a decline in fertility across the Western world. Now the COVID-19 baby bust will be even more severe. In fact, it looks like Generation Alpha, today's children and toddlers born after 2010, will be smaller than Generation Z, not just in America, but globally. Think about what this means. Today's youth are not just the present, they are also the future. So where today's youth go will literally determine the winners and losers of the 21st century. And while America's westward bound pioneers had to face the elements, they didn't have to contend with accelerating climate change. Some of America's most populous and economically significant cities, such as New York, Miami, Houston, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, are most at risk from rising sea levels, hurricanes, heat waves, and drought. Their GDP will suffer the most as temperatures and sea levels rise. For many centuries, most of America has fallen within what scientists call the optimal climate niche, the latitudes most suitable for comfortable human habitation and agriculture. But the climate niche is shifting northward, favoring the inland west, the Great Lakes, and the inner Atlantic regions. So is it time to think about America's next manifest destiny? Where should today's baby boomers move to have a climate-resilient retirement? Many snowbirds are now buying properties in Michigan instead of Florida. Where should young people buy homes as they seek to settle down and invest their savings? Already, many of them are leaving New York and California in favor of Colorado, North Carolina, and Vermont. And for many millennials and Gen Z, the American dream is no longer about a house at all. During the pandemic, sales of RVs soared. Companies like Kibbo offer not just the freedom of RV life, but even a sense of community at locations across the country. There are even tiny homes that can be towed or prefab houses that fit on the back of trailers. Imagine if all of them were electric vehicles that are solar powered. For more than 100 million youth, the mobile lifestyle makes a lot of sense. Less debt than a home, and you can either work remotely or keep moving to where the work is and learning skills along the way, whether academic or vocational. Humans have a fight or flight instinct, and our response to the climate change challenge and other disruptions is the right one: to move. More than 20 million Americans did move during the pandemic, but still far too many families and youth are stuck in place. They either can't afford to move or don't know where to go. And remember that less than 50% of American workers have or can work remotely. That's why I believe we have to redefine the American dream around mobility and skills, not just homes and degrees. We won't get out of a winner-take-all economy through handouts to the working class alone. People have to be empowered to go where they can learn new skills and take higher-paying jobs. To really make the new American dream inclusive, we have to appreciate that physical mobility is essential to economic and social mobility. And as in the 19th century, we may need to build this next manifest destiny as we move to it. America still benefits from the transcontinental railway and interstate highway system, but we also need the next Oregon trails. Fortunately, though the 19th century Manifest Destiny was for millions a leap into the unknown, the next one doesn't have to be. It can be a set of policies pre-designed to take into account the risks of climate change, the locations of important resources, the key national industries, and the skills of the American people. We can relocate people to climate-resilient zones where the population and economy can flourish, but also preserve our environment in the process. The Biden administration is going to spend trillions of dollars on an infrastructure plan and the Green New Deal. These can be the twin efforts to promote both mobility and sustainability. And in this next Manifest Destiny, we have to start thinking in terms of geology, not just nationality. Indeed, another relevant 19th century tradition in American thought is continentalism. At the time, this meant not only ejecting colonial powers such as the British, but also having more favorable regional relations with our neighbors, Mexico and Canada. The NAFTA trade agreement that went into effect in 1994 and the updated US-Mexico-Canada agreement signed in 2020 are evidence of a rising continentalist pragmatism. Already before the pandemic, US-Canada trade and US-Mexico trade each exceeded US trade with China. But much more can be done to promote complementarity among North American societies, whether the exchange of resources, labor, or technology. These have also been the two busiest international border crossings on Earth by far. North America is the only multinational continent that enjoys durable peace and stability. Let's not waste it. Our collective Manifest Destiny is surely a North American union. And thinking about the next Manifest Destiny isn't just a North American task. It's a global one. Our civilization is defined by 4 layers of geography: natural, political, functional, and human. But all over the world, these 4 geographies are badly misaligned. Yet we don't have to be prisoners to today's borders or unsustainable economies. We have a moral obligation to move people to resources and technologies to people. In the coming 2 decades, the world population will likely peak at about 9 billion people. It's up to us to decide how our children, can better distribute ourselves across 58 million square miles or 150 million square kilometers of territory. It's high time to start thinking beyond sovereignty to stewardship. For me, this is more than a thought experiment, more than a plea. It's a call to action. I've written a roadmap to help us evolve to this next stage of civilization, gradually, peacefully, and sustainably. Because a better world isn't just going to come to us. We have to move towards it. Thank you.
Aspen Ideas Festival is generously underwritten by Allstate, IBM, MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, Mount Sinai, PayPal, Walton Family Foundation, Verizon, and YouTube. Also, thanks to Prudential and the Rise Fund. That's a wrap for our Day 2 sessions, but the big ideas don't stop when the video ends. Get a head start on tomorrow's event at aspenideas.info/2021, where you'll see a list of our morning breakout sessions. We'll talk about equity, environment, and entrepreneurship, and how we can learn about happiness from the ancient philosophers. Tomorrow at 5 p.m. Mountain, we'll get a how-to on building a better internet through the lens of an empowering dating app. Yes, you heard me right, a dating app. We'll hear from Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot about the future of cities, and we'll talk about the search for intelligent life elsewhere in the universe and why it matters for this planet. Get a good night's sleep. We've got a lot to think about tomorrow.